Good evening. I'm Sarah Watson. Welcome to tonight's show, Toward the Sunset, the Homestead Act and Abraham Lincoln's Legacy in the West. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act into law, promising U.S. citizens and immigrants free land in the West. The Homestead Act, is one of the most important social policies ever enacted in the United States, and it combined with the 13th and 14th Amendment gave Black Americans an opportunity to own land after the Civil War. In total, 270 million acres were distributed through the Homestead Act. Dr. Jacob Friefeld is a historian and writer. His book, Homesteading the Plains, Toward a New History, challenges the scholarly consensus about Homestead Act of 1862. His forthcoming book, The First Migrants, How Black Homesteaders Quest for Land and Freedom Heralded America's Great Migration, tells the epic story of Black Americans homesteading in the Great Plains after the Civil War. Friefeld has a passion for making history accessible to broad audiences through his writing, public speaking, and work at the Abraham Lincoln National Presidential Library and Museum, where he serves as the Illinois and Midwest Studies Research Historian. For more information about Looking for Lincoln Conversations, visit the Looking for Lincoln Facebook page. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Jacob Friefeld.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you very much. And thanks, everyone, for joining me tonight. I'm excited to be here, virtually as it is. Usually I want to walk around when I do these, but I'm tethered to my desk. I'm here to talk to you about Abraham Lincoln's legacy in the West. Because usually when we're talking about Lincoln's legacy, we're probably thinking about 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, emancipation, all of those things tied together. Maybe even his legacy as a lawyer, if you tuned in last month with Sam Wheeler and John Lupton. But I'm going to talk to you about his Western legacy, particularly the Homestead Act, which you might not have heard much about. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why that is, why you might not have heard much about the Homestead Act, or it might not have seemed that important when you've heard about it before. But I'm going to start my story maybe in a strange place. In September 1877, with 300 Black Kentuckians leaving the verdant hills of Kentucky on a perilous journey, they hoped to bring them to their promised land. They were led by Reverend Simon Roundtree, who was formerly enslaved, and a white land developer named W.R. Hill. The following spring, another group of Kentuckians followed them on this journey. The first group gathered at the train station near nightfall, men, women, and children carrying their household goods with them and leading a few cows and horses along the way too. They crowded together, jostling each other as they boarded the train. Agents for competing railroads badgered them to buy tickets, lowering their prices as they went. They caught their train westward. The promised land they were headed for was called Kansas. They were going west to Homestead to claim free land from the federal government. Now, I guess we have to unpack that a bit. What does it mean to get free land from the federal government? Why is this land free? For much of the United States history after the Revolution, the cash sale of public lands was the law because the United States was broke. So they're gaining revenue through the sale of public lands. But as you get into the 20s and then the 30s, and it really starts to gain traction in the late 40s and 50s, Northern Whigs and Northern Democrats, and then Northern Republicans as well, all begin to start arguing for a land system that will bestow plots of free land to Americans who are willing to stay on it and farm. This actually passes during the Buchanan administration, is vetoed by Buchanan, and then Lincoln signs it into law in 1862. And Lincoln is a guy who believes in the Homestead Act of giving free land to Americans. He's quoted shortly after his election as saying, "I will simply say that I am for those means which give the greatest good to the greatest number, and that I'm in favor of the homestead law so that every poor man may have a home." So it's this idea that every poor man can have a home, but it's also built into the idea of free land policy is this discomfort with what's going on in the United States at the time. in previous generations, American men could pretty much rely on the fact that they would have an opportunity to become independent in some way, whether own their own farm. If they were an apprentice, they would then own their own shop. Maybe you'd start as a farmer, have maybe a short career with a store that doesn't work out, and then maybe you'd read the law and become a junior partner and then the senior partner in a law firm like Abraham Lincoln. But a lot of middle-class men, particularly those in Congress, are looking out at the world they see in the 1850s and early 60s, and they see the developing working class over the previous decades, men and women who are going to spend their whole lives working for wages. This is a new development that we sort of take for granted. Wage labor is sort of concerning to folks at this time. And so in Congress, when they argue for the free land policy, Republican Galusha Grow argues that providing a man with a plot of land to cultivate was, quote, the life spring of a manly national character. This idea that having independence and being able to just work on your own land gives you a manly character. Owen Lovejoy said, the man who during the day cultivates the soil which he owns and returns at evening to meet the wee ones running out to greet their father and to enter white-painted cottage to partake of the frugal evening meal, let these homes multiply. I mean, that's some sort of middle-class idolatry there. He wants to build this middle class out on the plains of the American West. Lovejoy continued, let the idler in the crowded city, the wage laborer, asking for charity of wages, go there and make him a home. Let the young man from the overpopulous states make him a home. Let those lads take their widowed mother and dependent sister and go there and make them a home. Let the foreigner who desires to escape despotism of other countries make him a home. A publisher writing to Lincoln shortly after his election also suggests that the Homestead Law is practically an excellent barrier against slave extension, because if these plots are for 160 acres or so, that's not enough to build a large plantation. Slavery is not going to be as profitable, perhaps, in the West, as some of the thinking that's going on in the Republican Party at the time. Let's make no mistake, though. These folks know that there are people living in the West already. Galusha Grow includes in his list of reasons to vote for the Homestead Act that, quote, the merciless barbarities of savage life will go away if you pass this free land law, this Homestead Act. So they're very aware this is a law for dispossession, but as well as this law that might take care of wage labor, make men independent farmers in the West. And so what is the law? The law that Lincoln ends up signing allows American men and women who are heads of households, that'd be single women, claim up to 160 acres of land as long as they build a house on it, make improvements, so plant crops, build fences, barns, usually dig a well, and then you have to stay on it for at least 5 years. And then you have the land free and clear. So for a small filing fee, you can get a 160-acre farm. 160 acres is the equivalent of like 120 American football fields. It's a lot of land. I mean, not as much as the southern plantations, but you can grow a lot on 160 acres. So the law goes into effect January 1st, 1863. We're going to take a look at some slides now. There they are. And this squirrely guy, Daniel Freeman, is sort of known as the first homesteader. That seems like it. Well, how can we know that? Well, I mean, there is some debate, but he does show up at his land office in Nebraska. He's from Illinois, so he goes to Nebraska, and he celebrates New Year's Eve at midnight from 1862 to 1863 at the land office filing his homestead at midnight on January 1st, 1863. So which means he probably knows the guy who works the land office, because land offices usually aren't open at midnight. Freeman celebrated this arrival of the Homestead Act, and there's a lot of anticipation. I've come across letters of, after Lincoln's elected president, there's a guy in Canada who writes to him and is asking the president-elect, well, if this Homestead Act passes, what lands exactly are going to be available? I'd like to come from Canada and homestead. Seems strange to be writing a guy who has not yet taken office about this. But Daniel Freeman's the first homesteader. And the process he's going to go through is he's claimed this land at midnight on 1863. He's going to go about making his improvements, building his house. And then 5 years later, he's going to go to the land office and prove up his homestead. He's going to gather witnesses who are going to give testimony. This is a witness form from a little bit later in the 1800s or early 1900s. But testimony would be similar. So Freeman's going to go in with his witnesses who are going to tell the land office that, yes, Freeman here it says cultivated 3 or 4 acres, and it'll say what he grew in which years. It'll testify that he's been on his land. And once this testimony is gathered, Freeman has proved up his homestead and he owns his land free and clear. Awesome stuff. And 1.6 million Americans follow Daniel Freeman's example with the Homestead Act. Like they go out, and 10% of the entire American national land of the current United States went into private hands through the Homestead Act. This is a very important part of Lincoln's legacy. But for generations, we didn't think it was, right? Because the historian called Fred Shannon, he comes out with this book called The Farmer's Last Frontier in 1945. And Shannon argues that the Homestead Act wasn't an important part of any legacy. It wasn't important forming farms. Most people bought their farms. If you see here on this slide, these are all the states where homesteading land was available during the life of the act. The purple states are the homesteading states. And Shannon says in these states, homesteading wasn't important because more people or more land was purchased than homesteaded. And that's sort of a logical error, right? Because homesteads can only be 160 acres. So if you have, let's say, 100 people homesteading, you have 1,600 or 16,000 acres. If you have someone who buys 2,000 acres outright, you have one farmer there, but you have the 10 homesteaders or 100 homesteaders who occupy their land. So maybe more land's been purchased, but you have more farmers who have gained farms through the Homestead Act. So that's a logical failure on Shannon's part. But also Shannon claims that, and this is like his biggest crime as far as I'm concerned, that he takes the number of farms in the United States in 1860, before the act was passed, and subtracts it from the number of farms in 1900. He's working with that 19th century Homestead Act. And he says, well, less than like a sixth of these farms were transferred through the Homestead Act. When Shannon does this, he not only calculates new farms in the areas where homesteading's allowed, these 29 states, he also includes new farms in areas where homesteading isn't allowed. So it's not really surprising that there's not a lot of homesteading going on in the states where homesteading is not allowed, because it's illegal. Now, if you limit the analysis to just the homesteading states, it turns out that 33% of the new farms during that period from 1860 to 1900 were transferred through homesteading. I don't think that's perfect either, though, because in 1854, there was a law passed that really made the land in Illinois, Ohio, and Indiana really cheap. So there wasn't much land left to homestead by the time the act passed. So if we limit our study to the states besides these three, it's 37% of new farms formed by homesteading. Now, the best number is to just use the Western United States, because that's where homesteading remains available longest. The southern states, the Homestead Act gets repealed there as the Reconstruction amendments. Reconstruction is betrayed by the Hayes administration and the Democrats in the South. So homesteading, if we just look at the West, these states in the Dakotas, all the way down to Oklahoma and westward, if you look at new farms formed in those states between 1860 and 1900, 64% of them were because of the Homestead Act of 1862. That's an immense amount of new farms compared to cash sales based upon this Free Land Act, which suddenly, when you take that against 1/6, as Fred Shannon claimed, to 64%, suddenly you have one of the more important social policies in American history that has really helped settle the West more than any other law. But Shannon wasn't done there. Shannon also claimed that even if it was a big deal, new farm formation, most people failed to successfully prove up their homesteads. He says that 2/3 of the people, in fact, failed to prove up. Well, Shannon made a mathematical error here. I won't go into the math too much, but as I mentioned, it takes 5 years to prove up a homestead. He was looking at the years up until 1880, and he wasn't taking that 5-year period into account. So he's counting people who just couldn't prove up yet as failed homesteads when he did his calculations. So we redid Shannon's calculations, correcting his math, my research team and I, and we found out that as few as 55% successfully proved up, and as many as 63% of homesteaders successfully proved up. That turns Fred Shannon's number on its head. So we can change his entire analysis of homesteading to that it was a small sideshow into the settlement of the United States to it was the most important law in the settlement of the United States in the second half of the 19th century. Shannon also claims that there's perhaps a 22 to 37% fraud rate in homesteading. People were just being hired as dummy entrymen, and then once they proved up their claims, they were selling them immediately. He has no math or data to back up this 22 to 37% fraud rate. There just isn't enough data to suggest this high of a fraud rate. He uses a lot of stories, and this photo is one of them. The idea is you have to build a house 12 by 14 feet, or 12 by 14, and this guy built it in inches rather than feet, and that's the home he's built on his homestead. There's no evidence this ever happened. This is from a newspaper at the time, and they're actually critiquing a completely different land law. We did some calculations based on a study area of 621 homesteaders, and we found that fraud in homesteading was about 8%, about the same as in the modern Medicare program, about what you can expect in any government program. So it turns out that the knowledge historians had taken for granted since 1945 about the Homestead Act of 1862 was just plain wrong. 1.6 million people claimed over 270 million acres of land over the homestead's existence. And it's an incredibly important part of Lincoln's legacy. But I'm going to argue it's important for another reason as well. And we're going to return to those Kentuckians we began with, traveling by train to Kansas. When these folks reached their stop in Ellis, Kansas, after switching trains multiple times, they still had miles to go. Like Black folks across the South, these folks from Lexington, Kentucky had celebrated in 1865 when emancipation occurred. And the promises of Reconstruction, they were elated. It was a time of jubilee. But by the time they had left for Kansas, the promises had turned to ash, producing anguish and at times horror, just violence. More than anything, they wanted land. Surely after generations of working in fields without pay, they were entitled to land. And they looked to the promises of the Homestead Act to get this land. Now, when they arrived in Nicodemus, Kansas, they were expecting to have a town ready for them. They walked the 37 miles from the train station looking for the town of Nicodemus that they had told would be waiting for them, this town that was going to be an all-Black town of homesteaders in Kansas. There was no town there. They had to walk, there were no roads, they had to walk through deer trails and buffalo wallows. They guided themselves by compass. What few features they could spot in a seemingly endless grassland, so different than the hills in Kentucky, helped them guide their way as well. There were no houses when they arrived, no buildings, and no church, that center of the Black community after the Civil War. They were promised an abundant amount of timber to build their homes. Now, if you've ever been to Kansas, particularly west central Kansas, there's not an abundant amount of timber to build your home. When they arrived, they were shocked. And so they had to dig in for the winter, and they literally dug in. What you're looking at in this slide is a sod house. So those walls are made of cut sod, and then it digs into the ground. Other dugouts, if you're lucky and you have a hill, you can just dig it directly into the hill. These houses are sort of notorious for, snakes falling through the ceilings. You're building your house with their house. You got to expect it. The next spring or summer, another group of Nicodemus settlers arrived. Williana Hickman was with them, also from Kentucky, and she looks out looking for Nicodemus. And suddenly she hears the men in her group yelling, "There's Nicodemus." And she says, or she writes later, she says, "I looked with all the eyes I had and said, 'Where is Nicodemus?'" And they pointed to smoke coming out of chimneys of dugout sod houses like these and said, "That's Nicodemus." And Williana Hickman remembers weeping when she saw these things. But most folks who arrived in Nicodemus stayed. Many took one look at it and went back to Kentucky, but a lot of folks stayed. Z.T. Fletcher and his wife, Jenny Fletcher, were two of them. They're pictured here. Z.T. Fletcher started a general store. People joked that it was a generally out of everything store because only was able to get a couple products in at a time. He started the first Nicodemus post office, and Jenny starts the second, aside from the church, the most important institution in Nicodemus, right in their sod house, that sod dugout. She has 45 pupils in Nicodemus's first school, and education is incredibly important to the Nicodemus folks. It's been denied a lot of them while enslaved, and now they're going to put an emphasis on it out here in the Great Plains. By 1879, Nicodemus is sort of thriving. It has a lot of dwellings. You notice this house, these are Nicodemus homesteaders. This is the Bates family, I think. They have a house made of plank wood, so they're doing well. That's wealthy for Kansas. I don't know how they got that wood out there, but they're showing off. You can see a horse in the background. They're showing off their wealth. They're dressed up, probably not working out in the field like that. Nicodemus is prospering. This is a celebration in the 1880s at Nicodemus. This is either 4th of July or their Emancipation Day celebration late in July. And Nicodemus has a complex racial relations in this sort of Western Kansas setting. They find opportunities they wouldn't have found in the Jim Crow South. E.P. McCabe is one of these early Nicodemus leaders who finds these opportunities. He arrives in Nicodemus in 1878, soon after it's founded. He is the first Black notary public in Kansas. The governor of Kansas soon appoints McCabe as the county clerk for Graham County, where Nicodemus is located. And he runs for the position again in 1881 and wins. And then he runs for statewide office. So E.P. McCabe is a Black man running for statewide office for auditor in 1882 in Kansas. And he wins. with Republican support. I mean, there's stereotypes used against him during the elections. There were racial slurs used against him in the election, but he wins a statewide election in Kansas in the 1880s. There's hostility as well. Neighboring towns, which Nicodemus is a town, but it's also these homesteads out in the hinterland. The neighboring town of Roscoe is several miles away, but Nicodemus folks go there and help build a flour mill. People work however they can get cash in the sort of a cash poor region at this time. So Nicodemus folks go and work at a flour mill in Roscoe, help build it. The white folks in Roscoe, they have a dance at the flour mill after it's built. Nicodemus folks show up, they want to take part. The Roscoe folks end the dance and then start it up again when they think the Nicodemus people have left. The Nicodemus folks return and start throwing rocks and begin stoning the flour mill. Shots are fired from both directions. There's a gunfight breaks out over attending this dance. So not everything was perfect. There's racism and racial conflict in Western Kansas this time, but no one is killed or arrested after this incident, which is very different than many of their experiences in the late Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction South, where there may have been a lynching, there may have been, it may have been a shock for those, a Southern town, for the neighboring black town to want to attend the dance with them. There is no retribution in Nicodemus. And Nicodemus would be an interesting case on its own, but it's not on its own. Nicodemus is joined by several black communities, and this is just 6 total. Nicodemus is in Kansas, but then there's DeWitt, Nebraska, Sully County, South Dakota, Empire, Wyoming, Deerfield, Colorado, and Blackton, New Mexico. All of these are important in their states as the largest Black homesteader settlements. And that slide I've moved past shows sort of what we're talking about with Nicodemus. Nicodemus is, as a town, its fortunes end in the late 1880s when it doesn't become the county seat and when it doesn't get the railroad. But the homesteaders persist. Each of these blocks on this map is 160 acres owned by Black homesteaders in Kansas. So these Black homesteaders persist in the hinterland, selling their goods in nearby towns. And it's the same in these other Black communities in the Great Plains. You might say, well, yeah, sure, it's free land. It's not, this isn't a revolutionary activity. But the folks who settled these towns thought this was a radical activity. I mean, Nicodemus, the town is named after a fictional enslaved person who wakes up after emancipation to celebrate the Jubilee. Blackton, New Mexico is named as if it's a kingdom of Black people. DeWitt, Nebraska is later changes its name to Audacious, Nebraska. And Empire, Wyoming needs no explanation. There's an important story of the Black West through homesteading that just hasn't been told. And it's a really important part of this Lincoln legacy because I think it works into many parts of the Lincoln legacy. There is the education aspect, right? Lincoln famously self-educated. In each of these places, education, just as in Nicodemus, is the school is the first thing next to a church that these folks found. But more importantly, I think it fuses 2 parts of the Lincoln legacy. And it's these Black homesteaders who fuse these 2 aspects, right? Emancipation, which happens, which is signed in 1860, or which is the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is put out in 1862, and then it goes into effect January 1, 1863, the same day the Homestead Act goes into effect. And Black homesteaders saying we're fed up with the oppression in the South after Reconstruction's been betrayed, fuses the legacy of emancipation with the Homestead Act and makes these places they create into the land reform that never happened in the South. Now, you might say, what do you mean land reform never happened in the South? They could have homesteaded in the South. I'm going to go back a little bit here to my map that shows these southern states. And there was a Homestead Act passed for the southern states that was repealed, surprisingly, around the same time as Reconstruction ended. It's part of that betrayal of Reconstruction. And not all of these, we shouldn't use these towns interchangeably either, these homesteading communities. Nicodemus has a different history than Deerfield or DeWitt, Nebraska. In DeWitt, Nebraska, I've talked to descendants who told me, well, it really wasn't meant to last, and it died out in the 1920s and 30s. It was meant for a place that the generation coming out of slavery could educate their children, and then they could go off to find whatever life they wanted to make for themselves. In Sully County, South Dakota, though, I talked to descendants of Black homesteaders who are still on land their ancestors homesteaded. It wasn't just a place to educate the children. It was a place to call home for generations. Each of these places has their own unique history. Oscar Michaud from Illinois, Metropolis, Illinois, famous Black filmmaker of the early 20th century. He homesteads in South Dakota in the early 20th century by himself. He is not in one of these communities. He is a Black man who decides to go to South Dakota and settle among white, mostly immigrant neighbors. Now, if you want to read about all of these communities, I do have a book coming out in August, The First Migrants, How Black Homesteaders Quest for Land and Freedom Heralded America's Great Migration. But you could also wait until maybe I'll come back next year and talk to you all about just Black homesteaders and really flesh out that story from Nicodemus into those other town sites and folks who homesteaded alone, like Washington Carver and Oscar Michaud. But now, sort of wrapping up, what is the legacy of the Homestead Act? How is Lincoln's legacy reflected in the West? Well, I think we have to definitely realize that this was Indian removal. It had to precede American homesteading, right? But the act also can't be reduced to that history. You can't reduce it to any one of its histories. It's also an awesome testament to the power of government to remove obstacles from people's lives and offer opportunity to advance. It's also a lesson that we can't do that on the backs of the most vulnerable in our society. We can't reduce the Homestead Act to just one of these legacies, but we do need to set aside that earlier legacy of Fred Shannon that refers to it as a sideshow in American history and really put it in front and center when we're talking about the West in the late 19th and early 20th century. And just some numbers that are sort of mind-blowing. 45% of all of Nebraska had its land transferred to private hands through the Homestead Act. 39% in North Dakota, 34% in Montana and Oklahoma, up to a quarter in Kansas. So this is a major law that has not been looked at closely enough. And I'm happy to take your questions now. You don't want to hear me talk anymore. Let's have a conversation.
Thanks, Jake. That was very interesting. And as Jake said, now it's time to take your questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please type it in the chat and we will try to get through as many of them as possible. And my name is Heather Fieser, Program Manager for Looking for Lincoln. So let's start with our first question, Jake. All right. So you talked a lot about homesteading. So you didn't talk about this element though. How did people know about the Homestead Act? Because you talked about how people weren't anticipating it and it was coming. So how did they advertise that you could go and stake your claim out west?
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, newspapers are reporting like the passage of the Homestead Act, so people know they can go west and claim land. But then you have these other companies, like I mentioned, those folks who went to Nicodemus. They were following Reverend Simon Roundtree and a white land developer. They had created the Nicodemus Town Company, which they hoped to lure people out to buy town plots to make money and establish a town in the area. And then they could organize the county, and a town that like Hill has really invested in ends up becoming the county seat of Graham County. But when the folks arrive, they're like, why would we buy these town lots? Like, yeah, great. You lied to us. And there's a great internal story too. They chased W.R. Hill around and try to get to him when there's no timber or houses like they were promised there. But they decide that maybe mostly the town lots aren't for us. We're going to go out and claim this free land. And then we can come to town to buy, sell, but why pay for the land we can get for free? We can get much more land than a town lot. So there's the land developers trying to lure people out, but it's pretty well known in newspapers that people can go west and claim land. Then once your family goes west, a lot of people writing back saying, "Oh yeah, I'm in Nebraska. It's paradise out here." And then a lot of those letters happen during like rainy years, and then family gets out there, and suddenly there's a drought and grasshopper infestation.
So they weren't writing about that, right?
Right. No, they hadn't experienced that yet. They didn't realize they were during a rainy period. And there is this myth as well that the rain followed the plow, that if you plowed your land, it would just create a wetter climate. And a lot of people bought into that, which, of course, is not true.
Yeah, no, that's not how that happens. All right, so here's your next question. Was it a perilous journey for many of them?
For a lot of folks, it was not. It was exhausting. A lot of the Black homesteaders that come out of the South, like in the next few years in the early 1880s, known as the exodusters, a lot of those folks are really poor. And it is perilous for them because they have to rely on charity to eat. The folks who went to Nicodemus had enough stuff to get them to where they needed to be. It's that first year that's perilous, though, because the Nicodemus folks got there too late to plant anything in that first season, so they had to survive the winter, and so they had to rely on charity a bit too. But if you were sort of going to the next layer of homesteaded land, you probably weren't in that dire of straits. You're probably taking a railroad most of the way. If you were going way deep, if you're going to Wyoming in the 1870s, that might have been a little bit trickier. But the big dangers were like prairie fire. Once you've built your homestead up, if prairie fire or grasshoppers take everything, you've got to find a way to survive. So it's almost more perilous once you've established your homestead because you're tied to that land. One guy remarks that the government of the United States bets you 160 acres that you can't last 5 years on your land.
And what was the success rate? Like, I know you touched on that to some degree, but for the majority of people, they were able to stick it out past the 5 years.
Yeah. So particularly in that 19th century era in the Great Plains, particularly, or in the West, you get that success rate of 64%. That goes down over time. And that's for a number of reasons. I think the final number is around 270 million acres of land and 1.6 million homesteaders. So I think You're still above or around 50% there. But later homesteads aren't as successful just because as folks keep moving west, you've got folks in the sand hills of Nebraska where it's exactly how it sounds. They're like hills of sand, it's good grazing land, but you're not going to graze much cattle on 160 acres. And they end up passing addendums to the Homestead Act. So, well, if you're in this area, you can claim 640 acres. Maybe that'll help. Those later homesteads aren't as successful because they're in much drier land. Like Blackton, New Mexico is even tough because they're trying to figure out what grows near Roswell, New Mexico.
Okay, here's your next question. So you did talk about the displacement that had to take place of Native Americans, but were there any Native Americans that were that were not removed, or was that pretty much? Because the question is more like, were there significant Native American encounters? Like, were there issues with that, or was that pretty much they'd already been moved off the land and they were in some reservation? Is that pretty much what happened?
Yeah, it depends on where you're looking. So in parts of Nebraska, a lot of that land had been ceded or stolen already, and so the homesteaders aren't encountering many Native people. However, we're talking about Oscar Michaud, who goes to South Dakota. That is takes place after the Dawes Act. So native land on the Rosebud Reservation is parceled into 160-acre plots, and each native person on the reservation gets, each head of household gets 160 acres. And then they take the rest of the land, declare it surplus, and then let non-Native Americans homestead on it. And then the idea here, so it's crafted that homesteaders, once they claim this land, they'll actually have to pay for this land as well once they prove up. And that money will be held in trust for the tribe. Land agents embezzle the money, and the tribe gets very little of the money that's made from this surplus land that essentially trying to well. Yeah, it's essentially a policy that's designed to force Native people to live on single family homes rather than communal homes and communal land.
Okay.
Yeah, so it depends on where you are. The Dakotas, the homesteaders are directly responsible for native removal. In other places, removal precedes homesteading by several years.
It really depends on where you are geographically, because there were so many states involved in and I learned that today. I didn't realize that all the states in the South, and I always think about homesteading as something that happened out west. So I thought that was very interesting how Florida was included in some of those states, and I never knew that. So
yeah, and that's sort of because Andrew Johnson puts the kibosh on land reform in the South to actually give plots of land to free people. And so everyone's scratching their head trying to figure out how we're going to provide land. And so the Southern Homestead Act is part of that. There are people who get land. We think maybe 1,000 Black Americans successfully prove up in 6 out of 6,000 claims. The land's rough too, though. It's a lot of timbered land. It's tough to clear. You have to have tools and capital to clear that land, where much easier in the Great Plains, where there are no trees, even though you have to live in a sod house.
Yeah. Okay. I have your next question. So what was your motivation for studying homesteading?
Well,
it doesn't seem to me like something you just kind of fall into, but maybe I'm wrong.
I'm a homesteading guy from way back. No, when I was in graduate school, I was sort of studying aspects of a growing American bureaucracy. So like an equally nerdy topic that you wouldn't think you just get into. But and then I came across the homestead records for Nebraska had just been digitized at that point. I started to talk to people at the Center for Great Plains Studies at Nebraska who are also interested in homesteading. We decided to get together and maybe we'll study these records and write like a collection of essays. Then we decide that it's going to work much better as a synthetic monograph, where we take a really close look at the previous scholarship, and then look closely at these Nebraska study areas that we have of 620 homesteaders. And so me and 2 other researchers did that, and then we're like, wow, we've got enough for a book. And that's how Homesteading the Plains was born. I think the Fred Shannon stuff was most shocking to us, because it was just based on like mathematical and logical errors. Was why homesteading isn't even mentioned in a lot of American history textbooks.
But it was significant. And what were the years again that homesteading was like?
Yeah, this is going to blow some people's minds. So it went into effect on January 1st, 1863, right? With Daniel Freeman showing up at the land office at midnight, living his good life. And it doesn't end until 1986 is when the Homestead Act is finally repealed.
What?
It's repealed in the 48 non-contiguous states in 76, but there's a 10-year extension for Alaska. And the last homestead is in that period. There's a guy who homesteads in Alaska. And I don't think there's much homesteading. I haven't looked closely at the numbers in the late 20th century, because a lot of things are happening around 1930, right? The Dust Bowls happened. You've got the Great Depression. A lot of these towns are failing. The actions in the city, America is, for the first time in 1920, a predominantly urban society. And so there's more there are more jobs in the cities, a better way to earn your living. There's more excitement in the cities. Leisure is more of a thing now in the 20th century. So that's sort of why the homesteading tapers off. And then I think someone claims a homestead in this, like the 60s or the 70s, and someone said, like, the reaction is essentially, well, this is still on the books. And then that's when they decide to repeal it.
And they decide they need to repeal it, but they get an extension in Alaska.
Alaska, yeah, where the guy homesteads. And there's a big thing in the last decade where the Homestead National Monument or the Homestead National Park now in Beatrice, Nebraska, worked with folks in Alaska, is that, like, the tractor of the last homesteader was, like, still on its land, and so they, like, airlifted it off and, like, put it on a boat. And the tractor of the last homesteader is in Alaska is now at the Homestead National Park in Beatrice, Nebraska. So if you go to the Homestead National Park, you can see that tractor.
I am honestly speechless because that's pretty significant. But wow, like, in my lifetime, there were still people homesteading. That's kind of, yeah, crazy. I thought it, like, ended in, like, the early 1900s.
When I started studying this, I just, like, it was a while before I realized that it was still on the books in 86. I just assumed it died after, like, World War II.
Yeah, that would make logical sense.
And there's actually, I'm sorry, I keep going.
Keep going. Forever, you're fine.
There is this, after World War II, there's this, the move to have another Homestead Act where they have this land and you can put in for a lottery to get these homesteads. And I think it's mostly for veterans. And some of these veterans end up on farms that were cleared and planted by victims of Japanese internment. And so, like, after the internment camps close, they're allowed to go home, and they take this land they've cleared and they raffle it off to a veteran to homestead on. And there's a great book on this that Brian Cannon, I forget what school he's at, but on homesteading after the World War II, which is really interesting.
That's tragic. There's lots of tragedy in the story of homesteading.
Yeah, I mean, dispossession is, like, that main tragedy, and then the folks who go out there and homestead, there are some real tragic stories of houses burning down, snakes falling into cribs with babies out of the ceiling because there's no way to prevent that. Grasshoppers eating your entire livelihood. Some of the descriptions of grasshoppers and locusts coming like storms over the plains are haunting.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine. So when you talked a little bit about Lincoln's legacy, but he signed it and it went into law. And how long had, like, legislation been pending to create the Homestead Act? Had that been something that had been going on pre-Civil War, or is it something that was developed as part of the Civil War?
Yeah, I knew I was going to get this question. I didn't go back and check to see the first time a free land law is enacted. But I mean, you can see the development. Like, there's always this push, particularly among Northern folks, sort of in states like Illinois, pushing for the development of Western states. And it's like a land policy, a free land policy is like one of these things that Lincoln and Douglas probably agree on, right? Like, what helps splinter one of these things that helps splinter the Democratic Party. Obviously, slavery is the main issue that splinters the party, but it's also free land policy and developing the Western states that way, because pro-slavery Southerners think that that's part of a plot to make sure slavery doesn't extend in the states. And it sort of was. I don't know if it would have worked like that. But yeah, so it's in the works for a long time, and you can see, like, they're trying to make land as cheap as possible. Northern Whigs and Northern Democrats, for a lot of folks trying to move west. So when I mentioned 1854, a lot of the old Northwest Territory, land is steeply discounted depending on how long it's been for sale. And like if it's been for sale for over 30 years, I think it goes down to something ridiculous, like 7 cents an acre or something. And so that's why there's so few homesteads in Illinois and Ohio, because it's constant push to make land more affordable and accessible to common Americans, which is, I think, sort of a radical idea.
Yeah, and you touched on that in the sense of, and I know that there were a lot of immigrants that did homesteading as well, I believe. I could be mistaken in that knowledge.
Oh yeah, and I mean, there's some arguments out there that is by design, right? Because congressmen are arguing that, yeah, the immigrants should come over. European immigrants should come over. That's the subtext of their arguments, and settle this land. And the thing about the Homestead Act is you need to settle your land for 5 years, right? You have to prove up. And if you're an immigrant, you have to become a citizen that time. And how long is the time between declaring that you want to become a citizen and becoming a citizen? 5 years. Perfect if you want to claim a homestead. Things can match up. So it's actually enticing for immigration to the West. So you get, I mean, amalgamation. You get Germans, you get German folk, Czech folk living within stone's throw of each other. One Black homesteader who's homesteaded not within one of the communities I mentioned ends up learning Czech because he's living among all these Czech immigrants in eastern Nebraska.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, so I think we've got through our questions. So I'm going to ask the question we always ask all of the people who come on our show, Jake. So I hope you're ready for this. Why do you think it's important that we still study Abraham Lincoln's legacy in the 21st century?
Because I think back to the Gettysburg Address, like, right, we need to dedicate ourselves. I'm going to mess up the quote now. To dedicate ourselves to the unfinished work, right? It's the unfinished revolution. There's so much more we can do for I think equality, access to education, access, and just Lincoln's idea of removing obstacles to people's opportunity to rise. I think there's so much we can do there, and studying Lincoln helps us to relight that beacon.
Well, thank you so much. And honestly, I do think it'd be really interesting to do a follow-up next year to learn more about Black homesteading. That was very interesting, and learning about the different communities and like some of the stories. So that was very interesting. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in this evening, and we hope to have you join us next month for our next topic. And have a good evening.
Thank you. It was a great time.